Good. Good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming over and finding a way to the basement room. Really delighted to welcome Teresa here. That's all who's visiting from University of Copenhagen, came over this morning. And yeah, really looking forward to your talk here around XR for behavior change. Thank you.
Thank you. So I assume the whole Zoom setup and everything is working, so I can just go ahead. Okay. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. It's super exciting to be here. I've heard, of course, about many of the people in UCLIC, but I've actually never been here, so it's super exciting to be here and present my work. So I want to start with a couple of... My clicker isn't working. Okay. No, it does. So I want to start with a short background. I've been an assistant professor in Copenhagen at the University of Copenhagen for, 2.5 years now. And I work in the human-centered computing section. This is a picture of us, I think it was in CHI 2023, so almost 3 years old, with our group. And then I'm also part of the Pioneer Center for Artificial Intelligence. This is this little group here. This is not the whole Pioneer Center, but this is the people in the what we call XR Collaboratory, which is mostly where I do my work. Yeah, so just to show you where I'm kind of coming from. My background is in computer science. I studied computer science in Ulm University in Germany, where I also did my PhD in 2022. Yeah, and today I just want to give you a short background of what I'm doing in general, and then I will present 2 upcoming works that fall into my research vision. So my research is generally at the intersection of immersive systems, in parentheses, extended reality. I will explain that in a second. And then artificial intelligence, and I do my work in human-computer interaction. So this is where I focus on when it comes to methods. So immersive systems. There are many terms around nowadays for augmented reality, virtual reality, extended reality, mixed reality, and then I call it immersive systems. So what I mean with that, or I kind of took this definition here from Slater and Wilbur from 1997, which is about immersion describing the extent to which the computer displays are capable of delivering an inclusive, extensive, surrounding, and vivid illusion of reality to the senses. That's a very long definition. Nowadays, as I already said, what we mostly see nowadays are technologies that do immerse the user to a certain extent. Fully immersion would be virtual reality, and then partially overlaying the physical world with digital information would be augmented reality. And I'm sure most of you have probably heard about that. I just wanted to kind of introduce it again. And then I use the term extended reality, which is an umbrella term that refers to virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, all in kind of one go. So this is the technology focus that I have. And then I did some work at the overlap of extended reality and artificial intelligence. This was mostly what I did during my postdoc work. So here I was interested in... I started my postdoc right after my PhD, of course, in 2022, and then there was a big boom of AI and XR, and I was very interested in, okay, what is going on here? What do XR researchers use AI for? So the first work that we then did in this space was to write a review to see about how people use it. Like, how do people who do mostly work on XR use AI? And then this is just a very short kind of overview of what we found. So we reviewed papers that worked at the intersection, and then found or grouped the topics that they did and the work that they did into several categories. And 3 examples here is that researchers use AI to create immersive worlds, to enhance interaction through user understanding. And back then, I think a big topic was embodied AI agents, which has since become, like, of course, even more populated. What I think is especially interesting about this work is that it was done just before LLMs or like ChatGPT, etc., kind of hits the main don't want to say the mainstream, but was more distributed in our community. So it's kind of interesting. Or now when I look back at it, it's kind of interesting to see what researchers back then focused on, because I think it will probably have changed quite a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah, so this is just an overview. On the very left, you can see a person who uses an LLM to create this virtual whale here in a mixed reality environment. And what is special about that one is that the whale is actually an object in the environment that has like that can be animated and actually does like movement. So it's not just a picture that you overlay. And then another example is that researchers use AI to enhance interaction. This is an example that we did a couple of years ago, where we used AI methods, and in this case, supervised machine learning methods, to understand people's symptoms that they experience while using virtual reality in this game. And then the third example is interaction with embodied AI agents. So this is a very kind of childish looking figure that was introduced to user study participants as an embodied AI. It was a Wizard of Oz study, actually. So we controlled everything that the agent did. But the kind of pitch in the user study was that this could be an AI which has a body and works with the user together to create, in this case, objects. This is just a very general overview of the intersection. And I will talk more about my recent focus in the next couple of slides. I just wanted to give a very brief kind of background of the methods that I use. As I said, I'm a computer scientist, so I was kind of trained in developing software. And then when I started my PhD years ago, I got into the space of HCI, which is super exciting, of course. And there I learned more about social and cognitive psychology methods that I now use in my work as well. I just put this slide here to give a very general overview of how I work. So what I usually do is I develop prototypes to answer research questions. I analyze them in experiments. I often do controlled experiments in the lab, but I am very interested in moving experiments kind of in the wild towards the end user at home. And I've done a couple of studies with users who own VR headsets and do the study in their homes. Of course, this comes with challenges and so on, but I'm very interested in developing methods to think about how we can do those studies in people's home with people who actually use the devices on an everyday basis. Because often, and you very well know this, in controlled experiments, at least in the space of VR and AR, we often have the problem that people haven't used the technology before, so there are a lot of novelty effects. Yes, and then I have kind of a pet research topic on the side, which is research synthesis or literature reviews. I like thinking about how we can improve the methods that we use to do those reviews. I know that many people are kind of tired of reading them and doing because they kind of peaked during COVID. But I think it's a very important type of research that helps the field in general. And I'm not only interested in doing that, but also in the methods that we use in HCI to improve that. Okay, but now to the focus of what I want to talk about in more detail today. So my research vision, what I want to work towards in the next couple of years, is to build a foundational understanding of how extended reality changes behavior and how we can use it as behavior change technology. So how I kind of got into this is I collaborated with people in psychiatry in the University of Copenhagen who use VR for patients with social anxiety and other social disorders. And I thought it's super interesting because it's a very good tool for them to have control over the study stimulus and put people into realistic situations. We can talk about realism and realistic and so on after the talk. But anyway, in this collaboration, we used it to understand to what extent patients actually have the same symptoms in VR than in their everyday life. And I thought that's in a way, of course, I've heard about that, but then I thought it's super interesting to think about why that actually works, to what extent it works, and what it is about VR that makes that work. So this is what I want to focus on in the future, not only with respect to this very specific use case of social anxiety, but more generally to how XR does influence behavior. So you might ask, why XR? And I brought a very basic kind of comparison. So it is hard to change behavior. It is like, what is it called? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it's really hard, even if you have very good intentions to change your behavior. We know that it's really hard to actually do it and follow through with it. And current technology-based interventions are very often focused around smartphone use or other digital devices that we have. And the interventions are very often based on providing information or knowledge. Something like step counts, for example. If you want to increase your physical activity, you would very often get, by using one of those physical activity apps, you would very often get an overview of your step counts at the end of the day, which then theoretically should motivate you to kind of do more. But we also know that providing information about your behavior doesn't have very huge effects when we look at it on a meta level. And I think there's kind of an example that everyone can think about in their daily lives. At least I have many examples of those where I know I want to change my behavior. I want to eat more healthy. I want to do more sport, etc. And I know very well, like I do have all the information about that. I know that it helps my health and so on, but I still don't do it. So this is what motivated me to think about what is different in XR. So what we have in XR is that the device we're using is not necessarily separate from our bodies, because we often use it in the form of glasses. So another way to think about it is that here, in the more traditional way, the content is inside the device. And then with XR, what we can do is to put the user into the content. And we have a lot of sensors in those devices. We have positional sensors, we have physiological sensors, we have activity sensors, theoretically, which could all be used to help recognize behavior, and then theoretically to make suggestions to improve it. So we have sensors for contextual understanding. I put perceptual control. We can also discuss that, but in theory, if we would use the devices in an everyday situation, we would have a control over what the person sees, which of course comes with a lot of negative effects, but I want to discuss it in the context of behavior change in a positive way. Yes, so we do have the kind of power to put application into the situation where the person actually is in, and personalize interventions. And then there are already a couple of examples that show that extended reality can actually change behavior to a certain extent. So there are quite a lot of studies on using VR for anorexia nervosa. I guess that's the right pronunciation, where we know that people with this disorder often have a distorted body image. And studies have actually shown that you can use VR to reduce those symptoms, and to link a better, or like a more comfortable emotional state to the representation of a healthy body. And since in VR, a person can kind of see themselves in the mirror, and then we can change the body shape in that mirror through multisensory integration, through seeing your body changed and touching your own body, you can actually create an illusion where you do give people kind of the feeling of a more healthy body image back. So there are quite many studies that show that this can be used in that context. Then there's another example. This one is from 2018, where participants embodied Einstein and then actually performed better in cognitive tasks when they were embodied in Einstein. This is an example of the so-called Proteus effect. Has anyone heard of, like, some people are nodding? Yes. Okay, so the idea of the Proteus effect is that people would adopt characteristics that they prescribe to the avatar that they are embodying, and would then behave accordingly. And there are a couple of studies on that effect. I think we still don't fully understand how it actually works, but it is a form of what we can call behavior change if we use that as an umbrella term. So in this case, people embodied Einstein and then performed better in a cognitive task than when not embodying Einstein, because the implicit assumption was that Einstein is a smart, or was a smart researcher, and then this somehow kind of then affected how people performed in those tasks. And then a third example is this one here. This was a study that was done during COVID, and here people embodied different avatars. And you can see here that the person is washing their hands, and they can see themselves, the avatar they embody, in the mirror, to give them a feeling of body ownership. Body ownership basically refers to, in VR, that you perceive the body that you are currently embodying as your real body, at least for the duration of the VR application. And here in this study, it was found that participants who embodied elderly persons actually increased their willingness to vaccinate with the COVID-19 vaccine, because the consequences of that were communicated to them with respect to effects of the elderly population, and that it actually helped to increase vaccination willingness. So these are 3 examples in VR of how we can use avatars in this case to influence people's behavior. But then I was talking about XR, and I've only presented to you VR for now. So these are 3 examples that are at least partially in augmented reality. And so this one is augmented reality, and these 2 cases are VR, but in these 2 cases, VR was only used as a study environment and was kind of simulating how AR, augmented reality use would look like. Okay, so this picture, it's a little dark. I don't know if you can see it. So it's a wood, so you can see trees. And then there are balloons filled with carbon CO2. And the idea here was that if you visualize the consequences that a person's CO2 usage has more visually, the idea was, or the question that the researchers asked was, does that influence how people indicate to what extent they are interested in climate healthy actions? And in the study, they found that visualizing the consequences, in this case, the consequences were visualized as like CO2-filled balloons. This is, of course, not an actual consequence. So if you engage in a CO2-heavy activity, it's not like suddenly there are balloons that are rising. But the method they chose to visualize it here was to do it with those balloons, to kind of make something very abstract more concrete. Yes. And here in the study, they found that visualizing the consequences can actually positively affect environmental self-efficacy. And then, so this is one example. The other example here, this one is an example about smoking cessation. So here the idea was, can we use augmented reality stimuli to also induce symptoms of smoking cessation? And can this be used as an exposure therapy technology? So here, okay, this is you can look through the smartphone, and this is the virtual image. So this doesn't really exist. It's just a virtual overlay of the actual environment. And the idea was here to use a smartphone app to induce stimuli that would trigger a person's symptoms in their everyday life. This is only a pilot study, so there hasn't been any published results about this. It's just an idea. And then in this study, here the participants were exposed to different coffee cups. So you can see it's a little darker here and it's a little brighter here. And the only thing that was changed is the color in virtual reality. Again, here the idea was to use it as a simulation of augmented reality. So you would actually drink the coffee and then have an augmented overlay that would change the color of the coffee. And what they found here is that participants actually had the perception that the coffee that looked whiter would actually taste creamier than in the other case. So again, just a couple of examples that show that augmented reality theoretically could be used to help people change their behavior by visualizing consequences, for example, or yeah, by actually changing perception in certain degrees, of course. And one idea around those studies that change like food appearances is that it could be used for dietary changes, that you could eat, yeah, that you could change how your food looks like to help people pursue a more healthy diet. So these are some examples. And I was very much interested in, okay, but does it work or does it not work? In what kind of situation does it work? Those embodiment effects, we do know that they work. Like for those studies that I presented, these effects were measured, but in my view, to make them actually more useful for the general population, we need to know if that actually works, or if these effects hold for longer times. So my goal in the next couple of I think it will be years, is probably to build a foundational understanding of how these effects work and to what extent they actually persist. And I want to present 2 papers to you that we wrote last year to show where we're at with this question. So the first one, it's called Experiencing Change. It's a literature review of behavior change with extended reality. So I kind of came with all these examples, like for myself, and then my idea was let's see what people have done, and let's try to summarize those effects to see to what extent, like actually what people have done in XR, and then if it works, like how are the effects reported. So we wrote this review, which included 53 papers from 2002 to 2025. And these are a couple of images of example papers. And we were interested, or our search term included behavior change as a term, and then several terms for extended reality technologies. We were interested in, which studies exist. And then we were interested in what do people report as the unique advantage of XR? Like, why do they use it? Is there like, what are the reasons that are communicated? What effects did they measure? How is the behavior that they study in their study in XR related to the behavior that they're aiming to change? And to what extent are the technologies or the interventions that were studied connected to behavior change theory? And I'll show you a brief overview. It's a very long paper, so I can't go into every detail. But I'll start with showing you the overview of some of those papers. It is a little small. Anyway, so I'll just talk about the images so you get an overview. So in the top left image, this is an augmented reality app. The person, it's video based, so a person sees the real world through a video. But then the spider that is here on the person's knees, that is actually virtual. So it's an augmented reality app which works in the actual world, and then the spider is virtual. In this context, it was used for exposure therapy reasons. So the idea was, can this virtual content be used for exposure therapy? Because it would be very useful because you have full control. Like you can make the spider smaller or larger, or you can have more spiders, fewer spiders. You have actually full control over the stimulus. Okay, then this one is also exposure therapy. You probably can't see it, but there's a dog here. And in this case, it was a person who's afraid. It was for people who are afraid of dogs, with the same kind of idea. Then this one was a visualization of consequences. So here the person, this was during COVID, and the person, you can see there are these orange, kind of dots on the person's hands, which stand for bacteria. And then the idea was to show the person here how to wash their hands effectively, such that all the bacteria would be washed away to reduce the risk of getting and spreading COVID. So these were more health related. Then there are also environment related applications that we found. Some of them used a simple overlay. So here in this case, it was a VR application where the person saw a 360 video of an area in the world that is heavily affected by climate change, in this case, coral reefs. And then they just used an overlay to show how more intensive environmental harm will affect this. And this is just one example. We actually found quite many that did something like that, which is quite simple. Like you show a 360 video of something that exists, and then you overlay it to show how it might look in the future if we continue to, or if we don't stop climate change. But then there were also more active applications. In this here, the person, so in this here, this is completely VR, and the person is in a cooking scenario. And then they are in a kitchen, which is surrounded by a forest. And then they are asked to prepare a certain meal. And by picking different dishes or different ingredients, the environment would actually change. So if you pick something for a meal which is more environmentally friendly, the forest would appear green. And then if you pick something which is more environmentally harmful, the forest would burn around you. Yeah, so just a couple of examples of what we found. Most of the applications and most of the interventions that we found were centered around the domain of like health, including mental health, preventive health, general health, physical activity. And then the second big bunch was around environment. So very similar to the examples that I've just discussed now. And then there were a couple of examples in other domains as well. And then what we were interested in is, so what makes XR special? Why do people in those studies use XR and not another technology? So we tried to, or what we do in the paper, we categorize, or we try to describe the experience that people see in VR along certain dimensions, design dimensions, or whatever you want to call it. So one of them is relation to physical world. Here we saw, so the black tree and this icon of a person, this stands for physical world. And then the blue things on top, this stands for virtual world. I will explain it. So in the first one, this is simply augmenting. So this is, okay, they take the physical world as it is and then augment something on top of it, which is also just very basic augmented reality. So that's basically that category. Then we found examples where people just used the actual content in the physical world and replicated it in VR. We called it replicating. So what I mean is it's usually video, so a direct recording of the physical world around you and then using that in VR. This is different from simulating. We classified it or categorized it differently from simulating, which would be we use something which exists in the physical world and then we make a simulation of that in VR. So here you can see two examples. This is a simulation of a classroom, and it's supposed to look like an actual classroom, but it's not a direct recording of a classroom. It is still a virtual one. Why we did this is because we were interested in the degree of visual realism. I think there is something in that on how important that is for those applications. So even though we do have the technology to make simulations quite visually realistic, most of the ones that we saw were rather simple, and you could clearly tell that it's not the actual physical world. Then another dimension that we used was what we call time projection. And we thought that this is actually one of the main advantages of XR. So in this case, you would take a physical state and then project it in time, either into the future or into the past. Yes, and then the very last one was what we called abstraction. So this one is actually using VR to create a completely abstract, non-existent, like not actually existent environment. And in this example here, people visualize their mental state and their emotions and using VR for that. Then another dimension that we used, or that we were interested in, is how is the experience in XR connected to the experience of the behavior? So, okay, maybe let me start with this one here. So there was something about in some of the experiences, people were active and had to do something, and in others, they were just passively watching. In some of them, they were doing the actual behavior that they're supposed to change, while in others, they were watching someone else doing the behavior that is being supposed to be changed. And then there was something about how people experience or how they view the content in the first place. So some of the applications used first-person perspective, but without a body. This would typically be videos. So you're in VR and you see a video from your first-person perspective, but you do not have agency, so you don't have a virtual body. So when you move, you can't see your real body at the same time. Yes, and then there were a couple of applications that embodied the user in VR. So here you can see very slightly. So here on the bottom, you can see that there are two hands. So in this case, the person would have a virtual body and act in the environment. And then in others, they would not have a body, but they would see themselves through a mirror. And then the third kind of analysis that I want to present here is we were looking into what are the unique advantages that people report in XR, that they use in XR compared to another technology theoretically. And we used BehaveFit, a framework that was developed by Wienrich et al., I think 2021, as a basis for grouping our unique advantages. So some of them, I don't know, some of them visualized abstract information. They used it to practice the behavior over and over again, because one of the advantages of VR and AR is that you can, yes?
Sorry, I'm really sorry. Wow. There seems to be a mess with room bookings in the class.
Oh.
Someone who has the room until 5, and there's a certificate to you guys going forward. Okay, then.
So do we have people here who are actually not interested in this at all and are supposed to be in the other room? Sorry for that.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Carry on. Okay. Yes, so we were interested in the unique advantages, and I presented some of them in this previous slide, which was this projecting something into the future and letting people experience their consequences directly now, or letting them experience a consequence that happens somewhere very far away from them, directly in their environment. This would be something like suddenly teleporting them into the rainforest, for example, where they would see the direct consequence of a behavior that you do right now. So you see the bars here. What we wanted to do is we wanted to use the dimensions on the previous slides and then understand, do they influence the effects? Can we do a systematic analysis, actually meta-analysis, to see if those effects, if those dimensions have effects? But our data was very diverse. So we had very few papers for each dimension, which then prevented us from doing an actual systematic meta-analysis. So we do report descriptive results, but I want to continue working on this topic and then work towards doing such a meta-analysis in the future. So we kind of do a very descriptive analysis of effectiveness, because this is what we want to know, right? We want to know, is it actually useful now, or is it just, I don't know, playing with people's creativity? So we analyzed short-term effects, long-term effects, and what we call comparative effectiveness. Short-term effects are studies where people measured a change in behavior directly after the study or directly after the experience. And then long-term effectiveness, we call it that, but that is, it's not actually like years long-term, but it's around 2 weeks after the experience where a study still reported effectiveness. And then comparative effectiveness is the third category, which were papers that compared something, behavior change technology in XR with one of another technology. Yes, so in summary, what we found is that 79% of papers that measured short-term effectiveness measured a positive effect. But I have to say, it's 79% of 19 papers. So just be careful when interpreting these results. And then for long-term effectiveness, we found that 63% of the 8 papers that measured behavioral outcomes for longer term studies were effective. And then for comparative effectiveness, we found that 57% of 14 papers that measured a behavioral outcome were effective. So I think these results are promising, but I also think that we need to continue to look into the actual effects of what is it that XR brings to the table here. And then there are a couple of areas to focus on in the future and problems that we found in the papers, or rather in this research area, and that are well known to behavior change researchers overall. So there was something where people or where researchers didn't directly, okay, let's just say that some measured behavioral intention, others measured behavior, and some of them very clearly indicated a difference and others didn't. And then there's also something about understanding to what extent intention then actually influences behavior. And this is well known in behavior change domain and researchers. It's just that it also occurs, so that we also find this in XR is why I put it here. And then I think another category or another, let's call it artifact that we observed and that is unique to this type of technologies is that there's something about measuring behavioral outcomes in the actual physical world when you do the behavior and measuring it in VR. So some studies also used VR really as a simulation technology, where VR was kind of, and then the behavior that people did in VR was taken for granted as a behavior in the actual world. So an example would be driving simulators, for example. Driving simulators in VR kind of, and I'm not an expert in that domain, I'm just taking it as an example, but it is kind of, in that space, VR is kind of used as a simulation that assumes that the behavior that people do in the study in a VR driving simulator would, or like does connect directly to the behavior they would do in the actual situation. And I think there's something interesting in this kind of dimension here to see if it actually holds and for which cases it holds. Yeah, and then we need to, or I want to understand better, so how is the behavior connected to the XR experience? We showed these dimensions, but yeah, as I already repeated several times, I'm interested in doing a deeper analysis of the effects there. So I think I still have like 5 minutes. Oh, what do you think? Yeah. Okay, so I'll very briefly talk about the other paper that I wanted to present. This is just a summary of what we found. This is a summary of the framework that we developed based on this paper. It's a lot of text. You don't need to read it. If you're interested in reading very long papers, I will send this to you if you want to. Yes, but now I want to very briefly talk about the second one. And this is one study that we did to kind of look deeper into the space of how does VR actually change behavior to a certain extent. So here we focused on the idea of perspective taking. And this is closely connected to empathy. So I don't know if you've heard, like maybe, okay, was it 2015-ish? VR was kind of introduced as this empathy machine. I don't know if you have heard that, but the kind of basic, and you could assume that with VR, you can put a person into another person's perspective, literally. Like if I could wear VR glasses, I could record what I do here. I could then give this application to someone else, and then they could watch it. And the idea would be that they could experience to some extent what I experienced. So they could take the perspective that I do, that I have. But of course, there are many pitfalls in this thought, because it's not just seeing what makes our experience. But this is kind of the basis, or like the grounding of what this paper or what this idea stands on. So we were interested in running a very controlled study on how do I put a person into another person's perspective, and how do very basic VR qualities influence that. We were specifically looking into spatial presence and agency. So the idea behind the idea behind choosing those two is that by many studies that look into VR empathy studies or VR perspective taking studies is that they often kind of assume that being in a more immersive environment or more realistic environment where I can act with an avatar's body would increase my empathy towards another person that I am embodying in that situation. And we were interested in, okay, but that's the very effect of putting you into a body that has agency, that can move, and does the very effect of putting you into a spatial surrounding. Does that already have an effect on perspective taking outcomes? Yeah, we'll just skip over this. So we did 2 studies where in one study we looked into how spatial presence influences the ability to take a perspective. And then in the second study, we looked into agency and the influence of agency on perspective taking. It's a quite complex study setup, but I'll just talk about the main results here. We were interested in two aspects of perspective taking, which is affective and cognitive perspective taking, where cognitive perspective taking refers to how well am I able to infer someone else's thoughts, and affective perspective taking is how well am I able to infer someone else's emotional experience. And we based our study on this study that was published, was it 2017, on psychological perspective taking. So we used the methods that they used in the study and then used it basically in VR. But the takeaway here is we did not find an effect on cognitive perspective taking. So the degree to which people felt present in the environment did not have an effect on the cognitive part, but it did have a positive effect on affective perspective taking. And then in the second study where we looked into into agency, which means to what extent are people controlling the body in VR, we found the same effect. So we also found no effect on cognitive perspective taking, but we did find that if people had higher agency, so more control over the body, they did have higher scores in the affective perspective taking measure. And this is just one study that we started with to investigate these effects. So what is it in VR that actually does help people experience empathy? And is there something about the very basics of the technology that can help? So this is just a sneak preview into the future, so to say. And with that, I'll just skip to my overview slide. So what I presented to you is my research kind of vision of to what extent can we use XR for behavior change? Can XR change behavior? And how does it? And if so, can we use it as a behavior change technology? I presented you one paper a little bit longer, which was about the framework that we developed for theory-driven XR behavior change interventions. And then the second one very briefly about perspective taking in VR. And I repeated my goal here. That's like a longer goal for the future. Thank you very much for coming to the talk and for listening.
Thank you so much. Right, so we've got time for questions. If you're online, feel free to write your question in the chat and we'll go in. Right, I'm going to jump straight in then, if you don't mind. I find your positioning there of the importance and value of literature reviews and surveys, I thought that was great. And I say this as an editor of a journal where we receive a lot of them. And I really struggle with it. And I think that's why I really valued you staying, because it's at one level, you don't want your journal or publication venue to be overrun with surveys, right? Because because pretty much every first year PhD student can submit one. So they do come in high volume. But then the criteria for how you choose them and select them is really thorny, other than must be timely and topical and going more than just bibliometrics and saying, look, the number of papers on this topic have gone up and here it is by country, which is like the starting point. But so I think that kind of fleshing out what it means to be a good literature review, to actually comment on the field, what's the level of depth that you talk about the papers. So that I think that's, people say, oh, we use the Prisma method and stuff like this, but fleshing that out, I think I've always struggled to communicate that to people who ask. So yes.
Yeah, I think it's a super fascinating topic because we do need those surveys. In my view, is that we need them. I mean, publications are like in all areas, publications just spike, right? There's no way you can read everything that comes up.
Well, the evidence shows, I mean, when they are published, they get cited massively, right?
Surveys.
Yeah. So they have value. Makes sense.
It's a research, so you can't read like 300 papers every week or whatever. But there are different survey methodologies, right, and different goals in surveys. So what I presented here is a scoping review, which is of which the idea is to scope out the field of research, and then there are others which are more systematic reviews, which actually look into effects of a very more detailed research question. And me and some colleagues / friends, we were kind of picking up on this maybe 5 years ago, when we were really struggling to write a review, because we were like, okay, but which method do I use now? Is it systematic? Is it scoping? Is it, I don't know, there are so many different ones. So we did a review of reviews in HCI. It's actually called umbrella review, and that's the actual term for that. I know that people have been making fun about it, but yeah, so we did this, I think in 2021, with Katja Rogers, who's the lead author on that paper, where we reviewed reviews in HCI to see what are they focusing on and what methods are they using. And I think what we found people were struggling with, and what we were struggling with ourselves, is that HCI is so diverse. Like, the methods that we use are so different. So it's actually not straightforward to summarize something in a field. You can either go very narrow to focus on a very specific research question, but if you go broad, it's kind of difficult to summarize research under a broad umbrella. So what we do in that umbrella review is to suggest the basic steps that we suggest one could follow when writing a review. But I don't know if that answers any of your questions, actually.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to think about how the technology can, the type of technology can change behavior. I was also thinking there's been an awful lot of research, especially here at UCL, on the different methods that you can employ. It might be social norms, it could be nudging, and then you think about how you might implement that in a technology. And I just wondered whether you've been, in your analysis, thinking about how your scoping review, the different ways in which XR has been used in relation to these methods, and how are you doing that?
Yes, thank you for asking. We actually, I didn't present it here. We analyzed the papers with regards to behavior change techniques and mechanisms of action, which are 2 frameworks that were developed at UCL. And we use their coding, like, it's those frameworks have very nice coding guidelines of how you can use them. You probably know this, to code behavior change interventions. So we use them to code the interventions that we found with regards to those theories. And okay, I did not put an overview. No, sorry, I did not put an overview slide of that in the talk, but we do have the overview in the paper to see which methods are used. And like, just one takeaway we had is that, interestingly, and maybe it's not even surprising, is that many papers we found are focusing around knowledge as a mechanism, which I presented in the very beginning. I think VR and AR have more to offer than just the knowledge part, but I think the kind of development of those interventions probably comes more from the traditional kind of technology view. So we need to understand more about what the technology can bring to the table, to then understand how can they be used for the methods that have been identified by behavior change research.
Thank you for the nice outcome. A lot of people are going to read your paper. In your presentation, you seem to see XR as mainly driven from a visual stimuli. Are you considering also other form of XR that are not? Yeah, we worked a lot on sound, including with Anisha, and I don't know if you know Anna Tajadura, for example, altering the perception of your own body. And you talk about do this effect continue do occur in real life and not just in the lab, and so some other, I mean, I imagine the head mount display are going to become lighter and lighter, but there are also other forms that are more easy to wear in everyday life, and also easier to explore to what extent they really apply to the real life rather than just to the experiment.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. In this review, we focused on visual overlays. Do you call it audio overlays? I don't think so. So on the visual channel. I fully agree that VR and probably more VR is very much focused on visual stimulation for now. And there's a lot of research going on also on haptics, of course, and audio. In this case, yeah, we didn't include that because the papers we've reviewed, many of them were from medical domains where I think the technology was kind of new. And then we're just really focusing on the visual part. So there wasn't much, at least systematically explored. I think to actually have a holistic or comprehensive view of that, we do have to include other modalities. But I'll start with the basics of the vision first.
No, I was curious not commenting about your paper, but more in your plan and the vision, if you will.
Yeah, and I think there's something super interesting about like body-mind connection, and also what we do a lot in VR is those redirection techniques. They are influenced visually, but it is kind of changing your body's movements. Like we do a lot of those redirected walking where you make people walk in a circle in the real world and then in a straight line in the virtual world, just to deal with physical constraint. And also the same exists for grasping, for example. But I think something like that could be useful in that domain as well. We didn't find any paper that actually used some of those effects. And they are visual, but they do also, like there are also audio-based techniques in that domain. So I think it's interesting to look into in the future, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this seminar is very good, and I want to ask a question: is there any research on the like based on visual but with added like hardware like joystick or newly produced hardware or IoT? Is there any research related to this field?
Probably. But in this case, we only looked into full body, yes, fully immersive VR, like headset-based VR. I don't think we had any that used a joystick or other IoT devices, but I'm sure there is. It's just not included in this.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Oh, we'll make that the last question, Alicia.
Yes. Get the last word. Thank you. Great talk. I was just wondering, so if you were to, based on the review that you did and other things, in terms of influencing behavior and intention to change behavior, what do you think is the best use of VR technology, of XR technologies? What kinds of behaviors and intentions should we really be targeting with this?
Yeah. So our idea when we did this review was that that it would be useful for things that you can't visualize or communicate to people in traditional media, which would be projecting you into a future and then making that future more real to you, which would then kind of motivate you to change your behavior. But I think based on the review, I can't give you a clear result. That was my guess in the beginning, but then we didn't actually find that many papers on that. But I think it's also something about the technology being still, it's not new, but in those domains it is rather new. So I think it needs to build up over time to build a understanding of how you can use the technology. I know I'm kind of like wailing around your question. I don't have a clear answer on which behavior specifically it would be useful, because I think we are lacking the foundational understanding of those very basic things like perspective taking. It sounds easy, but I don't think it's trivial actually. Like, thanks. Thank you.